Persuasion by Jane Austen. Chapter 21. Anne recollected with pleasure the next morning her promise of going to Mrs. Smith's, meaning that it should engage her from home at the time when Mr. Elliot would most likely be to call, and for to avoid Mr. Elliot was almost the first object. She felt a great deal with goodwill towards him in spite of the mischief of his attentions. She owed him gratitude, and, in regard, perhaps compassion. She could not help thinking much of the extraordinary circumstances attending their acquaintance, of the right which he seemed to have interested her. But everything in situation, by his own sentiments, by his early worthy inquiry, for there was a Captain Wentworth, and be conclusion of the present suspense, good or bad. Her affections would be his for ever. Their unison, she believed, could not divide her more than other men. Then their final separation. Prettier musings of the high-wrought love and eternal constancy would have never passed along the streets of Bath, and Anne was sporting from Camden Place to Westgate Buildings. It was almost enough to spread purification and perfume all the way. She was just sure as a pleasant reception, and her friends seemed this morning particularly obliged for her to coming, and hardly to have expected her, though it might have been an appointment. An account of the concert was immediately claimed, and Anne's recollection of the concert were quite happy enough to animate her features by making her rejoice to talk of it, and she could tell that she told most gladly, but all was little for the one who had been there, and unsatisfactory for such an inquirer as Mrs. Smith, who had already heard, through the short cut of a laundress and a waiter, rather more of a general success and produce of the evening than Anne could relate, who now asked in vain for several particulars of the company. Everyone had any consequence of or notoriety in Bath was well known by the name to Mrs. Smith. The little Durants were there, I conclude, said she, with her mouths open to catch the music, like unfledged sparrows ready to be fed. They never missed a concert. Yes, I did not see them myself, but I heard Mr. Elliot say they were in the room. The Iversons, were they really there? And the two beauties with a tall Irish officer, who is talked of for one of them. I do not know. I do not think they were there. Old Lady Mary McLean. I do not need ask after her. She never misses, I know. You must have seen her. She had been in your own circle, for as you went with Lady Dalrymple, you were in the seats of the grandeur round the orchestra, of course. No, that's what I always dreaded. It would be very unpleasant for me in every respect, but happily Lady Dalrymple chooses to be farther off, when we were exceedingly well placed for hearing, and I might not say for my seeing, but I appear to have seen very little. Oh, you saw enough for your own amusement. I can understand. This sort of domestic enjoyment needed to be known even in a crowd. This you had. You were in a large party yourself, and you wanted nothing beyond. I ought to have looked more about me more, said Anne, conscious while she spoke that there had been no want of looking about, that the object had only been deficient. No, no, you were better employed, and you need not tell me that you had a pleasant evening. I see it in your eye. I perfectly see how the hours passed, and you always have something agreeable to listen to. In the intervals of the concert it was a conversation. Anne half smiled, and said, "Do you see that in my eye?" "Yes, I do. Your countenance perfectly informs me that you were in company with last night with the person whom you think the most agreeable in the world, the person who interests you at this present time more than any rest of the world put together." A blush overspread Anne's cheek. She could say nothing. "And being such a case," continued Mrs. Smith, after a short pause, "I hope you believe that I do not know how to value your kindness in coming to me this morning. It really is good of you to come and sit with me, and when you have so many pleasanter demands upon your time." Anne heard nothing of this. She was still in astonishment and confusion excited by her friend's penetration, unable to imagine how any reports of Captain Wentworth could have reached her. In another short silence, "Pray," said Mrs. Smith, "is Mr. Elliot aware of your acquaintance with me? Does he know at all that I am in Bath?" "Mr. Elliot!" repeated Anne, looking up surprised. A moment's reflection assured her the mistake she had been under. She caught it instantaneous. Recovering her courage with a feeling of safety, soon added, more composedly, "Are you acquainted with Mr. Elliot?" "I've been a good deal acquainted with him," replied Mrs. Smith gravely, "but it seemed worn out. It is a great while since we've met." I was not at all aware of this. You never mentioned it before. I had known it, but it would have been a pleasure of talking him to you, to him about you. "To confess the truth," said Mrs. Smith, assuming her usual air of cheerfulness, "that is not exactly the pleasure I want you to have. I want you to talk about me to Mr. Elliot. I want your interest with him. He can be essential service to me, and if you would have the goodness, my dear Miss Elliot, to make an object of yourself, of course it is done. I should be extremely happy. I cannot doubt my willingness to be of sure the slightest use to you," replied Anne, "but I suspect you considering me as having a higher claim on Mr. Elliot, and a right to influence him than is really the case. I am sure you have, somehow or other, inhibited such a notion. You must consider me as the only Mr. Elliot's relations, if in that light there is anything which you suppose his cousins might fairly ask of him. I beg you would not hesitate to employ me." Mrs. Smith gave her a penetrating glance, and then smiling, said, "I've a little premature, I perceive. I beg your pardon. I ought to wait for official information. But now, my dear Miss Elliot, as an old friend, do give me a hint of when I may speak. Next week? To be sure, by next week may be allowed to think of it all settled, and build my own selfish schemes on Mr. Elliot's good fortune." "No," replied Anne, "nor next week, nor next, nor next. I assure you that nothing of the sort you are thinking will be settled any week. I am not going to marry Mr. Elliot. I should like to know why you imagine I am?" Mrs. Smith looked at her again, looked earnestly, smiled, shook her head, and exclaimed, "Now, how do I wish I understood you! How I wish I knew what you were at! I have many a great idea that you do not design to be cruel when the right moment occurs. Till it does come, you know, we women never mean to have anybody. It is a thing of course among us, that every man is refused, till he offers. But why should you be cruel? Let me plead for my present friend, I cannot call him, but for my former friend. When you look, where can you look for a more suitable match? Where can you expect a more gentlemanlike, agreeable man? Let me recommend Mr. Elliot. I am sure you hear nothing but good of him from Colonel Wallace. Who can know him better than Colonel Wallace?" "My dear Mrs. Smith, Mr. Elliot's wife has not been dead much of half a year. He ought not to be supposed for paying his addresses to anyone." "Oh, if these are your only objections," cried Mrs. Smith archly, "Mr. Elliot is safe. I shall give myself no more trouble about him. Do not forget me when you are married, that is all. Let him know me as a friend of yours, and he will think little of the trouble required, which is very natural for him now, with so many affairs and engagements of his own, to avoid all and get rid of as he can. Very natural, perhaps. 99 out of 100 would do the same. Of course, you cannot be aware of the importance of to me. Well, my dear Miss Elliot, I hope and trust you'll be very happy. Mr. Elliot has a sense to understand the value of such a woman, and your peace will not be shipwrecked as mine has been. You are safe in all worldly manners and safe in his character. He will not be led astray. He will not be misled by others to his ruin." "No," said Anne, "I can readily believe that all that of my cousin. He seems to have a calm, decided temper, not at all open to dangerous impressions. I consider him with great respect. I have no reason, from anything that has fallen with my observation, to do otherwise. I have not known him long, and he is not a man, I think, to be known intimately soon. Will not this manner of speaking of him, Mrs. Smith, convince you that he is nothing to me? Surely this must be calm enough, and, upon my word, he is nothing to me. Should he ever propose to me, which I have little reason to imagine he has any thought of doing, I shall not accept him. I assure you I shall not. I assure you, Mr. Elliot has not the share which you have been supposing in whatever pleasure the concert of last night might afford. Not Mr. Elliot, that is, not Mr. Elliot, that—" She stopped, regarding with a deep blush that she had implied so much, but would less hardly been sufficient. Mrs. Smith would have hardly believed so soon that Mr. Elliot's failure, but from the perception of there being somebody else, as it was, she instantly submitted. There was all the semblance of seeing nothing beyond, and Anne, eager to escape farther notice, was impatient to know why Mrs. Smith would have fancied she was to marry Mr. Elliot, where she could have received the data, or from whom she could have heard it. Do tell me first how it came first to your head." "It came only to my head," replied Mrs. Smith, "upon finding how much you were together, and feeling the most probable thing in the world for to be wished for everybody by belonging to into either of you, and you may depend on it that to find your acquaintance dispose of you in the same way. But I have never heard it all spoken of till 2 days ago. And it has indeed been spoken of? Do you observe the woman who opened the door to you when you called yesterday?" "No." "Was it not Mrs. Speed, as usual, or the maid?" "I observed no one in particular." "It is my friend, Mrs. Rook, Nurse Rook, who, by the by, had a great curiosity to you, and uh, delighted to be in such a way to let you in. She came away from Marble Buildings only on Sunday, and she is the one who told me you were to marry Mr. Elliot. She had it from Mrs. Wallace herself, which did not seem bad authority, and she sat an hour with me on Monday evening. She gave me the whole history." "The whole history," repeated Anne, laughing. "She cannot make a very long history, I think, of one such little article of unfounded news." Mrs. Smith said nothing. "But," continued Anne, presently, "though there is no truth in having my claim this on Mr. Elliot, I should be extremely happy to be of use to you in any way that I could. Shall I mention to him of your being in Bath? Shall I take in a message?" "No, I thank you. No, certainly not. In the warmth of the moment, and under a mistaken impression, I might, perhaps, have endeavoured to interest you in certain circumstances, but not now. No, I thank you. I have nothing to trouble you with. I do think you spoke of having known Mr. Elliot for many years?" "I did. Not before he was married, I suppose." "Yes, he was not married when I first knew you." "And you were much acquainted?" "Intimately." "Indeed. Then do tell me what he was at the time of the life. I have great curiosity to know what Mr. Elliot was a very young man. Was he at all as he such appears now?" "I have not seen Mr. Elliot these 3 years," was Mrs. Smith's answer, given so gravely that it was impossible to pursue the subject further, and Anne, having felt that she had gained nothing but an increase of curiosity. They were both silent. Mrs. Smith was very thoughtful, and at last, "I do beg your pardon, my dear Miss Elliot," she cried in her natural corn of cordiality. "I beg your pardon for the short answers I've been giving you. I've been uncertain that I ought to do, and my doubting considering as to what I ought to tell you. There were many things to be taken account, and one hates to be officious in giving bad impressions, making mischief, and even the smooth surface of the family union seems well worth preserving. And there might be nothing durable beneath. However, I determine I am I think I am right. I think you ought to be made acquainted with Mr. Elliot's real character, though I firmly believe that, at present, you have not the smallest intention of accepting him. There is no saying what might happen. You might, some time or other, be differently affected towards him. Hear the truth. But now, while you are unprejudiced, Mr. Elliot is a man without heart or conscience, a designing, very cold-blooded being, who thinks only of himself, who, for his own interest or case, would be guilty of any cruelty or any treachery that could be perpetrated without his risk of general character. He has no feelings of others. Those whom he had been the chief cause of leading into ruin, he can neglect and desert without the smallest compunction. He is totally beyond any reach of any sentiment, or justice, or compassion. Oh, he is a black heart, hollow and black." Anne's astonished air and exclamation of wonder made her pause. In a calmer manner she added, My expression startle you. You must be allowed for an injured, angry woman. I will try to command myself, and I will not abuse him. But if you only tell what I have found him, facts, I shall speak. He was an intimate friend of my dear husband, and I trusted and loved him, and I thought him as good as himself. The intimacy had been formed before our marriage. I found then them most intimate friends, and I, too, became excessively pleased with Mr. Elliot, entertained the highest opinion of him. At 19, you know, one does not usually think very seriously. But Mr. Elliot appeared to me as quite as good as others, and much more agreeable than most others. We were almost always together. We were principally in town, and living in very good style. He was then the inferior in circumstances. He was then the poor one. He had chambers in the Temple, and it was as much as he could do to support the appearance of a gentleman. He had always been home whenever he chose it, and he was always welcome like a brother. My poor Charles, who had the finest, most generous spirit in the world, would have divided his lost farthings with him, and I know that his pursuit was open to him, and I knew he often assisted him. "This must be the very period of Mr. Elliot's life," said Anne, "which has always excited my particular curiosity. It must have been about the same time that he became to know my father and sister. I never knew him well myself. I only heard him, and there was something different in his conduct to them, with regard to my father and my sister, and afterwards, in circumstances of his marriage, which I could never quite reconcile with the present times. It seems to announce a different sort of man." "I know it all, I know it all," cried Mrs. Smith. "He had been introduced to Sir Walter and your sister before I was acquainted with him. But I heard him speak of them for ever. I know he was invited and encouraged, and I know he did not choose to go. I can satisfy you, perhaps, on points which you would little expect. And as to his marriage, I knew all about it at the time. He was privy for all the fors and againsts. I was the friend whom he confided his hopes and plans, though I did not know his wife previously. Her inferior situation in society, indeed, rendered that impossible. Yet I knew her all her life afterwards, or at least till within the last 2 years of her life, and can answer any question you may wish to put." "Nay," said, said Anne, "I have no particular inquiry to make about her. I have always understood they were not a happy couple. But I should like to know why, at the time of his life, he should slight my father's acquaintance as he did. My father was certainly disposed to take very kind and proper notice of him. Why did Mr. Elliot draw back?" "Mr. Elliot," replied Mrs. Smith, at the period of his life, had one object in view, to make his fortune in by a rather quicker process than law. He was determined to try to make it by marriage. He was determined, at least, not to mar it imprudent marriage, but I know it was his belief, whether justly or not, of course I cannot decide, that your father and your sister, in their civilities and invitations, were designing a match between the heir and the young lady, and it was impossible that such a match could be answered to his ideas of wealth and independence. That was his motive of drawing back, I can assure you. He told me the whole story. He had no concealments with me. It was curious. And, having just left you behind me in Bath, my first and principal acquaintance on marrying should be your cousin, and that, through him, I should be continually hearing of your father and sister. He described one Miss Elliot, and I thought very affectionately of the other." "Perhaps," cried Anne, struck by a sudden idea, "you sometimes spoke of me to Mr. Elliot?" "To be sure I did, very often. I used to boast of my own Anne Elliot, and to vouch for you being a very different creature from—" She checked herself just in time. "This accounts for something which Mr. Elliot said last night," cried Anne. "This explains it. I found that he had been used to hear of me, and I could not comprehend how. What wild imagination one forms where dear self is concerned! How sure to be mistaken! But I beg your pardon, I have to interrupt you. Mr. Elliot is married then completely for money? The circumstances possibly first opened your eyes to his character?" Mrs. Smith hesitated for a while. "Oh, those things are too common. When one lives in the world, a man or woman's marrying for money is too common to strike one as it ought. I was very young, and associated only with the young, and we were a thoughtless, gay set, without any strict rules of conduct. We lived for enjoyment. I think differently now. Time and sickness and sorrow had given me the other notions, but that period I must own I saw nothing reprehensible in what Mr. Elliot was doing. To do the best himself as to pass the duties. But she was not a very low woman?" "Yes, which I object to. But he would not regard. Money, money, that's all he wanted. Her father was a grazier. Her grandfather had been a butcher. But that was all nothing. She was a very fine woman, had a decent education, was brought forward by some cousins, and throwed by chance into Mr. Elliot's company, and fell in love with him, and not a difficulty or scruple was there on his side, with respect to her birth. All his caution was spent in being secured with the real amount of her fortune, before he committed himself. Depend upon it, whatever esteem Mr. Elliot may have for his own situation in life now, as young man, as a young man, he could not have the smallest value for it. His chance for Kellynch estate was something, but all the honour of the family he held as cheap as dirt. I often heard him declare, if the Baronessies were saleable, anybody could have his for £50, arms and motto, livery, name and livery included. But I will not pretend to repeat half that I used to hear of him say on the subject. It would not be fair, and yet you had often proved, for what this all is but assertion, that you shall have proof. "Indeed, my dear Mrs. Smith, I want none," cried Anne. "You have nothing contradictory to what Mr. Elliot appeared to be some years ago. This is all in confirmation, rather, of what we used to hear and believe. I am more curious than why he should be so different now. But for my satisfaction, I think if you would have the goodness to ring for Mary, stay, I am sure you will have the greater goodness of going yourself into my bedroom and bringing me the small inlaid box which you will find on the upper shelf of the closet." And, seeing her friend to be earnestly bent on it, did as she was desired. The box was brought and placed before her, and Mrs. Smith, sighing over it as she unlocked, said, "These are full. This is full of papers belonging to him, to my husband, and a small portion only of what I had to look for when I lost him. The letter I am looking for was written by Mr. Elliot to him before our marriage, and happened to be saved. One can hardly imagine, but he was carelessly and methodical, like other men, about those things. When I came to examine his papers, I found that with others still more trivial, from other people scattered here and there, while many letters and memorandums of real importance had been destroyed. Here it is. I would not burn it, because even that little satisfied with Mr. Elliot, I was determined to preserve every document of former intimacy. I had now another motive of being glad that I can produce it. This was a letter directed to Charles Smith, Esq., Tunbridge Wells, and dated from London as far back as July 1, 1803. "Dear Smith, I have received yours. Your kindness almost overpowers me. I wish nature and had such hearts as yours more common. But I have lived 3 and 20 years in the world and seen nothing like it. At present, believe me, I have no need of your services, being in Cashigan. Give me joy. I've gotten rid of Sir Walter and Miss. They are gone back to Kellynch, and made me almost swear to visit them in the summer. But my first visit to Kellynch will be with a surveyor, to tell me how to bring it with the best advantage to the hammer. The baronet, nevertheless, is unlikely to marry again. He is quite fool enough. If he does, however, they will leave me in peace, which may set a decent equivalent for the reversion. He is worse than last year. I wish I had any name but Elliot. I am sick of it, and the name Walter I can drop, thank God, and I desire you will never insult me with my second W again, meaning for the rest of my life it only to be yours truly, W.M. Elliot." With such a letter could not be read without putting Anne into a glow, and Mrs. Smith, observing the high colour on his face, said, "The language, I know, is highly disrespectful. Though I've forgotten the exact terms, I had perfect impressions of the general meaning. It shows you the man. Mark his professions to my poor husband. Can anything be stronger?" Anne could not immediately get over the shock and mortification to finding such words applied to her father. She was obliged to recollect that her seeing the letter was a violation of the laws of honour, that no one ought to be judged or be known by such testimonies, that no private correspondence could bear the eye of others, before she could recover calmness enough to return the letter which she had been meditating over, and say, "Thank you. This is full proof undoubtedly, proof of everything you were saying. But why be acquainted with us now?" "I explained this too," cried Mrs. Smith, smiling. "Can you really?" "Yes, I've shewn you Mr. Elliot as he was a dozen years ago, and I will shew him as he is now. I cannot produce written proofs again, but I can give you an authentic oral testimony as you can desire, of what he is wanting now, and what he is now doing. He is no hypocrite now, he truly wants to marry you, and his present attention to your family are very sincere. Quite from the heart I will give you on my authority his friend Colonel Wallace." "Colonel Wallace! You are acquainted with him?" "No, it does not come to me in quite such a direct a line as that. It takes a bend or two, of nothing consequence, but the stream is good at first, and a little rubbish, as it collects, of churning, and easily moved away. Mr. Elliot talks reservedly to Colonel Wallace of his views of you, and which said, Colonel Wallace, I imagine to be in himself, has been a very careful and sensible and discerning sort of character. But Colonel Wallace had a very silly, pretty silly wife, whom he tells things which he had better not, and he repeats it all to her, and she, in the overflowing of her spirits of her recovery, repeats it all to her nurse, and her nurse, knowing my acquaintance to you, brings very naturally all to me. On Monday evening, my good friend Mrs. Brooke let me thus much into the secrets of the marble buildings. When I talked of the whole history, therefore, you see, I was not romancing so much as you supposed. My dear Mrs. Smith, your authority is deficient. That this will not do. Mr. Elliot's having any view on me will not the least account for the efforts he had made towards a reconciliation with my father. And this was all prior to my coming of Bath. I found them on the most friendly terms when I arrived. I know you did. I know it all perfectly, but indeed, Mrs. Smith, we not must expect to get the real information in such a line. Facts or opinions are to pass through in the hands of so many, to misconceive by folly in one, and to ignorance in the other. You can hardly have much truth left. One gives me a hearing, you will soon be able to judge the general credit due, by listening to some particulars which you can have yourself immediately contradict or confirm. No one supposes that you were his first inducement, and he had seen you indeed before he came to Bath, and admired you, but without knowing it to be you. So says my historian, at least. Is this true? Did he see you last summer or autumn, somewhere down the west, to use her own words, would be knowing it would be you? He certainly did, so far it is very true. At Lyme, happened to be at Lyme. Well, continued Mrs. Smith triumphantly, grant my friend the credit due to establishment for the first point asserted. He saw you then at Lyme, and liked you so well as to be exceedingly pleased to meet you again in Camden Place, as Miss Anne Elliot, in that from the moment, I have no doubt, but had a double motive of his visits there. There was another, and an earlier, which I will now explain. If anything in my story makes you to be either false or probable, stop me. My account states that your sister's friend, the lady house staying with you, how whom I had heard you mention, came to Bath with Miss Elliot and Sir Walter as long ago as September. In short, they first came themselves, and had been staying there ever since. That she is a clever, insinuating, handsome woman, poor and plausible, and altogether in a situation and manner to give a general idea among Sir Walter's acquaintance of being to be Lady Elliot, and as general a surprise as Miss Elliot should be apparently blind to the danger. Here Mrs. Smith paused a moment, but Anne had not a word to say, and she continued. This was the light in which it appeared to those who knew the family, long before you returned to it, and Colonel Wallace had his eye upon your father enough for it to be sensible of it, though he did not then visit in Camden Place, but his regard for Mr. Elliot gave him an interest in watching all that was going on here. And when Mr. Elliot came to Bath for a day or two, as he happened to do a little before Christmas, Colonel Wallace made him acquainted with the appearance of things, and the reports beginning to prevail. Now, you are here to understand that the time had worked a very material change in Mr. Elliot's opinion as the value of baronetcy. All upon the points of blood and connections he is a completely altered man. Having long as much as money he could spend, nothing to wish on his side as avarice or indulge, he had been gradually learning to pin his happiness on consequence he is heir to. I thought it coming that before his acquaintance was ceased, but it is now a confirmed feeling. He could not bear the idea of Sir William, you may guess, therefore, that the news he heard his friend could not be very agreeable. Now you may guess what is produced. The resolution of not coming back to Bath is as soon as possible, and of fixing himself here for a time with the view of his renewing a former acquaintance, and recovering such a footing in the family that might give him the means of asserting a degree in his danger, or of circumventing the lady if he found it material. This was agreed upon between two friends as he was the only thing to be done. Colonel Wallace was to assist in every way that he could, and he introduced, and Mrs. Wallace was to be introduced, and everyone was to be introduced, that Mr. Elliot came back accordingly, and on the application was forgiven, as you know, and readmitted into the family, and there it was, his constant objection, and his only objection till your arrival at another motive, to watch Sir Walter and Mrs. Clay. He omitted no opportunity of being with them. He threw himself in their way, called at all hours, but I need not to be particular on the subject. You can imagine what an artful man would do. And with this guide, perhaps, may recollect what you have seen him do. Yes, replied Anne. You tell me nothing which does not accord for what I have known, or could imagine. There is one thing something offensive in the details of the cunning. The maneuvers of the selfishness in duplicity must ever be revolting. I've heard nothing which really surprises me, for those who would be shocked by such a representation of Mr. Elliot, who would have difficulty in believing it. I would never have been satisfied. I always want to come up with some other motive for his conduct than appeared. I should like to know his present opinion as to the probability of the event he has been in dread of. Whether he considers the danger of being lessening or not. Lessening, I understand, replied Mrs. Smith. He thinks that Mrs. Clay afraid of him, and aware he sees through her and not daring to proceed as she might do in his absence. But since he might be absent of some time or another, I do not perceive how can he be secure of holding her present influence. Mr. Wallace has an amusing idea, as the nurse tells me, is to be put in the marriage articles when you and Mr. Elliot marry, that your father is not to marry Mrs. Clay, a scheme worthy of Mr. Wallace's understanding, by all accounts, but my sensible nurse Rookie sees the absurdity of it. Why, to be sure, ma'am, she said, it would not be prevent his marrying anybody else. And indeed, to own the truth, I do not think nurse, in her heart, is a very strenuous opposer of Sir Walter making a second match. She should be allowed to have a favour of matrimony, and, you know, and since self will intrude, who can say that may not have some flying vision of attending the next Lady Elliot through Mr. Wallace's Mrs. Wallace's recommendation. I am very glad to know this, said Anne, after a little thoughtfulness. It'll be a bit more painful to me in some respects to be in company with him, but I shall know better what to do. My line of conduct will be more direct. Mr. Elliot is evidently a disingenuous, artificial, worldly man, who has never had any better principle to guide them than selfishness. But Mr. Elliot was not done with. Mrs. Smith had been carried away from her first direction, and Anne had forgotten, in the interest of her own family's concerns, just how much had been originally implied against him, and her attention was now called to an explanation of those first hints, and listened to the recital if which it did not perfectly justify the unqualified bitterness of Mrs. Smith, and proved to have been very unfeeling with its conduct towards her, and very deficient in both justice and compassion. She learned that the intimacy between them continuing unimpaired by Mr. Elliot's marriage, that it had been before always together, and Mr. Elliot had led his friends into their expenses, and much beyond his own fortune. Mrs. Smith did not want to take blame herself, and was most tender in throwing any on her husband. But Anne could recollect that their income had never been equal for their style of living, and that there had been a great deal of general enjoining extravagance. From his wife's account of him she could discern Mr. Smith as being a man of warm feelings, easy temper, careless habits, not strong understanding, and much more amiable than his friends, very unlike him, and led by him, and probably despised by him. Mr. Elliot, raised by his marriage to a great affluence, was deposed to every gratification of pleasure and vanity which he could command without involving himself, for which all his self-indulgence had become a prudent man, and beginning to be rich, as just his friend ought to have himself poor, and seemed to have no concern at all for having that friend's probable finances, but on the contrary had been prompting and encouraging expensive, which only could end in ruin. The Smiths accordingly had been ruined, and the husband had died just in time for knowledge the full knowledge of it to be spared. They had previously known embarrassments enough to try the friendship of their friends, and to prove that Mr. Elliot better not be tried. But it was not until his death that the wretched state of the affairs was fully known, and with a confidence in Mr. Elliot's regard, more creditable to his feelings than his judgment. Mr. Smith had appointed him the executor of his will, but Mr. Elliot would not act. The difficulties and distress which this refusal had heaped on her, in addition to the inevitable sufferings of her situation, had been such as could not be related with an anguish of her spirit, or listened to without corresponding indignation. Anne was shewn some letters on his occasion, and answers to urgent applications to Mrs. Smith, which all breathed the same stern resolution of not engaging in a fruitless trouble, and, under a cold civility, the same hard-hearted indifference to any of the evils it might bring on her. It was a dreadful picture of ingratitude and inhumanity, and Anne felt, at some moments, that no flagrant open crime could have been worse. She had a great deal to listen to, and all the particulars of the past sad scenes, and all the minutiae of distress upon distress, which in former conversation had been merely hinted at, were dwelt on with natural indulgence, and Anne could perfectly comprehend the exquisite relief, and was only the more inclined to wonder at the composure of her friend's usual state of mind. There was one circumstance in the history of her grievances and particular irritation. She had good reason to believe that some property of her husband in the West Indies, which she had been where which had been for many years in a sort of sequestration for the payment of its own encumbrances, which might be recoverable by proper measures, in this property, though not large, would be enough to make her comparatively rich. But there was nobody to stir in it. Mr. Elliot would do nothing, and she could do nothing herself. Equally disabled from the present exertion, and by her state of bodily weakness, and employing others by the want of money. She had no natural connections with sister even with her counsel, and she could not afford to purchase the assistance of the law. This was a cruel aggravation that straitened the means, that she felt she ought in to be better circumstances, that a little trouble in the right place might do it, and to fear that it might be even weakening her claims. It was hard to bear. It was on this point that she hoped to engage Anne's good offices with Mr. Elliot. She had previously, in anticipation of their marriage, been very apprehensive of losing her friend by it, but on being assured that he could be no attempt of the nature, since he could not know her to be in Bath, it immediately occurred, and something might have been in her favour by influence of the woman he loved, and it had been hastily preparing to interest Anne's feelings as far as the observances due to Mr. Elliot's character would allow, when Anne's refutation of the supposed engagement change faced everything, and while it took her from her new-formed hope of succeeding in the object of her first anxiety, left her at the least in comfort of telling the whole way of her own story. After listening to this full description of Mr. Elliot, Anne could not but express some surprise at Mrs. Smith having spoken to him so favourably in the beginning of their conversation. She had seemed to recommend and praise him. "My dear," was Mrs. Smith's reply, "there is nothing else to be done. I consider your marrying him as certain, though he might not yet have made the offer. Could no more speak the truth of him, as than if he had been your husband. My heart bled to you, as I talked of happiness. Yet he is sensible, he is agreeable. With such a woman as you, it would not have been absolutely hopeless. He is very unkind to his first wife. They were wrenched together. She was too ignorant and giddy for respect, and he had never loved her. I was willing to hope that you must fare better." Anne could acknowledge with herself the possibility of being induced to marry him, and it made her shudder at the misery of what followed. It was just been possible that persuaded by Lady Russell, and under such a supposition would have been most miserable. When time had closed at all, too late? It was very desirable that Lady Russell should no longer be deceived, and on one of the concluding arrangements of this important conference, which carried them through the greater part of the morning, was, that Anne had full liberty to communicate to her friend everything relative to Mrs. Smith, in which his conduct was involved.